all of those kind of impulses fused in me, and eventually, and I sort of realized, like, oh, this is what I want to write. I want to write a book that's a memoir that isn't about me. Or a memoir that's only kind of partly about me.
Welcome to The Book I Had to Write. I'm Paul Zakrzewski. Here's something from the beginning of Matthew Specktor's most recent book. It's called Always Crashing in the Same Car. Quote, "All my life, I have been fascinated by those figures whose status is faintly marginal, those who failed, those who faltered, those whose triumphs are punctuated by flops." The book is a love letter to those figures from Matthew's past. The musicians, the writers, the filmmakers, all these folks who crossed paths with Hollywood and who came away a bit worse for wear. There are fascinating chapters here on people that you're likely to know, like the author F. Scott Fitzgerald, or the filmmaker Hal Ashby, the guy that made all those cult classics like Harold and Maude. But there's also lesser recalled icons, like the actress Tuesday Weld, or brilliant but overlooked screenwriters like Carole Eastman and Eleanor Perry. In the book, Matthew also weaves his own story of creative crisis, making sense of the 2008 Hollywood writer's strike, or an estrangement from his mother, or an unexpected divorce. Although Matthew's book came out a few years ago, I've really been wanting to talk to him for this season. That's because I've been wanting to dig into the current trend in hybrid memoir, which is to explore these big culture stories that move beyond the personal. And I think Always Crashing in the Same Car is one of the best examples I know. Matthew Specktor's books include the novels That Summertime Sound and American Dream Machine, which was longlisted for the Folio Prize. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, GQ, the Paris Review, Tin House, and numerous other places. And he was also a founding editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books. I really hope you enjoy our conversation. Matthew, it's a pleasure to talk with you.
Likewise. Really pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to kick things off by asking why this book, Always Crashing in the Same Car, was a book you had to write.
Such an interesting question, but I mean, obviously they're all books I had to write one way or another. But this one had a strange genesis in that there was a novel that I had written in the I guess I started it in like 2013 and worked on it until 2016. That I had finished, and that had, I mean, it had a bunch of stuff that was nothing like Always Crashing in the Same Car, but some of the stuff in it was, sort of coded, the sort of memoiristic aspects of Always Crashing, or some of them were encoded in one of the characters in the novel. And I got to the end of the novel, and my agent, the person that was then my agent, liked it. Everybody, the people who read it seemed to really like it, and I just couldn't get comfortable with it. I just kept looking at it and sort of thinking, it's not like there's anything wrong with this book, but I don't think I want to publish it. So I parked it, and I had been thinking, I think a lot of my reading at that time had been kind of skewing towards books that were, one book that was kind of instrumental in writing this was Hilton Al's The Women. I was just kind of fascinated by the way that he was writing about his mother through writing about these three different other figures who were not his mom. I'm trying to think what I was into at that time. I was really into books like Heidi Julevitz's The Folded Clock came out and made a big impression on me. Sarah Manguso's 300 Arguments. I realized that I was kind of responding to texts that weren't novels. And then I had also been kind of busy writing a script that I was not enjoying. And NYRB asked me to write the intro to the Eve Babbitt's book, to Slow Days, Fast Company. And I wrote that in the space of an afternoon. It was like, I just thought to myself, like, God, this is the most pleasurable writing I've had in a year and a half is this piece of criticism. And it was kind of all of those kind of impulses fused in me, and eventually, and I sort of realized, like, oh, this is what I want to write. I want to write a book that's a memoir that isn't about me. Or a memoir that's only kind of, partly about me.
Wait, why do you say that? A memoir that's only partly about you? That's really interesting.
Because mostly I don't love memoirs that are just about the person writing them. It's kind of it's not a form that attracts me all that much. So I felt like here was a chance to write a book that could unite all of these different strands. And I think in my heart, I still kind of think of that book as being secretly a novel, not because it's, full of made up shit. I mean, I certainly had to shift some things around and change the timeline, and there are aspects of it that are invented or adjusted, just as there would be in a novel. But also because I think I have strong feelings about, kind of sometimes I think our idea of what a novel is pretty limited. That there's no reason why a novel can't be like 98% fact.
It's interesting because the title, I know, alludes to a David Bowie song. It's on his album Low. And I was a huge Bowie fan, but I have to admit, I hadn't really listened to Low.
Oh, yeah.
Like those albums from the mid 70s or late 70s.
Oh, it's the best. Those are like the best ones. They're so good. Yeah.
Where he's like all coked up and hanging out with Brian Eno.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because I guess when it came out, it wasn't very celebrated. It got a lot of bad reviews, and it's a weird
record. And no, I didn't have that. I mean, it wasn't, there were a few reasons for the title, and titles are always odd because it's like I either know them when I start or I don't have one, and it ends up being kind of a thing that I have to try to, paste on at the end, which is a lot harder. In this case, I did know at the beginning. I sort of landed upon the title for two reasons. One, I think that the person at the heart of the book, the self that I'm really describing, even if the narrative thread is mostly contemporary, or, mostly my adult self, there's a very vulnerable teenager at the heart of that book. And I think that was a record that really spoke to that moment in my life. But also the sort of the Tom McGuane's car crash, the famous story that gets recounted in it where Tom McGuane decided to become a screenwriter after he was driving he won the National Book Award, bought a Porsche and was driving that Porsche at like 140 miles an hour, like got into this enormous wreck, was hospitalized, and the legend was mute for a while in the hospital. He couldn't speak or wouldn't speak. And when he emerged from the sort of fog of his muteness, he just decided, like, I have no interest in being a novelist. I'm going to go to Hollywood and have some fun and make some money. But, that kind of thankfully now bygone sort of late 20th century myth of artistic success and artistic freedom and license, where it's, you sort of, I think every young writer has a dream at one point where they sort of think, like, I'm going to win the National Book Award and Hollywood's going to come knocking at my door and I'm going to have lots of money and I'll be able to write whatever the fuck I want. All these things that are completely understandably the dream of any writer who's just like struggling to get published and struggling to get noticed, And that's the McGuane moment seems to sort of both emblematize that piece of mythology and it's that mythology and the sort of sourness of that mythology, the uselessness of it for anybody that is the book's subject. Yeah.
It's interesting. So there's a kind of lengthy introduction in your book about F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
And this is not the F. Scott Fitzgerald of the 20s and, the stories that earned thousands of dollars and jumping in the Plaza Hotel and The Great Gatsby.
Yeah.
This is latter F. Scott Fitzgerald. So The Crack Up, The Last Tycoon. And I thought, I hadn't thought about this in so long, but reading your book made me pull this out.
Oh, amazing. What is that? I've never seen that, actually.
Yeah, it's called F. Scott Fitzgerald on Writing. It came out sometime in the late 80s when I was in college.
Amazing.
And I thought we could play. I thought this is the game portion of the podcast.
Yeah.
I had randomly pulled out. So it's just quotes from his letters, from some of his novels and different drafts. And it's kind of notes on craft.
Oh, amazing.
So I'm just going to pull out something random and have you react to it.
Great, please.
Okay, here's one. It was my first inkling that he was a writer. And well, I like writers because if you ask a writer anything, you usually get an answer. Still, it belittled him in my eyes. Writers aren't people exactly. Or if they're any good, there are a whole lot of people trying so hard to be one person. And that's from The Last Tycoon.
Yeah, I love that. I actually, that happens to be a passage that I do quote inside the book, I think. One thing about that Fitzgerald section is that at the very last minute, I cut it in half. That chapter was longer. And my agent editor my agent, who's just like, so she's the most wonderful person. I whenever she tells me to do it, or suggests any idea she has, I basically just do it without thinking. It's it's really nice to have even if it's one that I kind of resist, I sort of go, well, Allison's right. She's always right. And she came to me at the initial version of that chapter was had just much more about Fitzgerald and Allison was like, I think we want to get into the sort of present tense of the book a little quicker. So I don't remember if that stayed or left. But it's true. And I think, Fitzgerald, there's such a schism for me between the Fitzgerald I love and the Fitzgerald that, he was definitely a writer who wrote a lot of things that were not wonderful. Yeah. This Side of Paradise, which was his first novel, which was the book that kind of made me want to be a writer in the first place, is just an awful book. It's not a good novel at all. And of course, he went on to write The Great Gatsby and the Pat Hobby stories, which are his kind of Hollywood short stories. I kind of hate. They all seem kind of like Roadrunner cartoons, where it's the sort of scheming screenwriter Pat Hobby always being hoisted on his own petard like the coyote. And The Crack Up is funny because it's such an iconic piece of Fitzgeraldian writing, and I think it's full of shit. I think there's a kind of nihilistic posturing in it that I don't actually think. I think Fitzgerald probably convinced himself of it.
In that essay or in the whole book?
In that essay in particular. It's a fascinating essay, but I don't actually believe that that Fitzgerald himself was a cracked plate who could never paste himself together. Again, I think The Last Tycoon, which is a fantastic novel, even in its unfinished form. I think I prefer it to The Great Gatsby, to be honest, by leaps and bounds. But that passage, a writer is, many people, trying to be one person, it's so good. It's so, wise and interesting and true to himself. And true, I guess, to the, even true to the spirit of the book I just wrote. It's, on some level, the course of the book is me kind of identifying with all these different personalities who are pretty dissimilar. Except for, a certain tendency to get in their own way, which I think most writers, probably all writers, have to some degree or another,
You also write about, you have a couple chapters in here about iconic or lesser known Hollywood writers, Eleanor Perry and Carole Eastman.
Yeah.
Eastman in particular really resonates for you. You write at one point that, quote, more than any other figure, I'm in love with her.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know she was best known for that great Jack Nicholson movie, 5 Easy Pieces.
Yes.
Could you talk a bit about what you found so compelling about Carole Eastman?
I certainly can speak. She is someone who had kind of crept along. She shows up in the periphery of all the Hollywood lore about the 70s. If you read Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, or if you read about Jack Nicholson or Warren Beatty, inevitably Carole Eastman's name comes up, and there's always this kind of crazy description where, Robert Towne, I think, described her as being like a tulip with a long stalk. There's this kind of beautiful, every sort of capsule description of her talked about how beautiful she was, how she was, agoraphobic and didn't like to go outside and wouldn't eat in restaurants and hated to be photographed and was kind of this incredibly enigmatic figure. And I do love 5 Easy Pieces. I think that movie is a masterpiece. And as I sort of delved into, the other thing she wrote a movie called Puzzle of the Downfall Child with Faye Dunaway, which I think is quite wonderful. She wrote a Monty Hellman Western called The Shooting, which I think is amazing. A very kind of strange, almost Beckett-like Western. She had done all this cool stuff, and then she wrote this Mike Nichols movie called The Fortune that starred Jack Nicholson and Warren Beatty that was a huge flop and that is kind of a mess. And then, her career, I think, kind of never got back on its feet. But, I wanted to kind of figure out who she was or is, because there was almost nothing on the internet about her. There was a single essay by this guy, Nick Pinkerton, which I thought was great. And I knew her papers were housed at the University of Texas in Austin. So when I went to look at her papers, there were prose writings in there, as well as unpublished screenwriting, and it was the prose writings, which were pretty slender, but they were like, it was like reading Hart Crane or Wallace Stevens, or it was like definitely not. This was not the writing of a screenwriter, or a person that was only a screenwriter. These were the writing of a poet, and she was a tremendously literary person, but very, very, very well read. I found out kind of after the fact that her closest friend for a long time in her life was Michael Silverblatt of Bookworm, that they were sort of thick as thieves, and they had a kind of special relationship. And she was, like a lot of writers, I think, someone who really, really, really suffered and struggled a lot when she was not writing, or often when she was sort of trying to find a piece of writing. I feel like she's someone who the kind of private paper trail is one of tremendous, tremendous anguish. Just someone kind of fighting herself at every turn. And as someone for whom writing doesn't always come easily, I too have had long periods of drift and struggle. And I know writers who don't. I know writers who just kind of seem to hop easily from one project to another. I do not, or historically I have not.
Those folks don't tend to come onto my podcast.
No, I wouldn't think so. And to be honest, I guess I have this kind of private theory that, there's this sort of Graham Greene model. There are plenty of writers, and even literary writers, who could somehow manage like a book a year or a book every other year, and over the course of a lifetime they could produce 25 or 30 books. And then there's there are the writers who produce maybe 5 so 5 to 7, and I think I'm probably on that plan. But I also think that ultimately, like, for the most part, even the writers who are super prolific, Philip Roth, unbelievably great writer, very, very few of those books that he wrote were poor. Probably only about a half dozen of them are great. Really, truly great.
So there's Carole Eastman. There's
Yes.
actually, I'd say half the book is a look at women who are brilliant and important, and yet somewhat overlooked.
Yeah.
There's Tuesday Weld, and
Sure.
even Renata Adler, who is obviously really well known, but maybe hasn't gotten all that due.
Yeah, I think you would. She's well known to people like us. She's no longer well known to people on the street.
Exactly. Tell me more about that. Was that a conscious move?
It was definitely. It was absolutely a conscious choice. My mom was not. My own mother was. I don't think that she was an overlooked creative genius by any means, but I think in many ways she might have been, if she had ever really had space to develop her talents. And she both didn't, because she was kind of born into a generation when women were expected to be secretaries, the sort of Eve Babbitt's generation, and didn't because she then made a series of choices, like, getting married to a Hollywood agent, having children like my sister and me, and then by the time she did start writing, she became a screenwriter. She made an ill-advised choice to, and it's kind of an interesting mystery that's partly at the heart of the book I just finished, about whether she how much she knew about what she was doing. She scabbed during a strike, is what she did. She rewrote somebody else's screenplay, and there's some plausible deniability around whether she thought she was just teaching herself to write by working on a movie that was dead, or actually rewriting a movie for a studio.
And for listeners who might not know that, that's just such a huge no, especially in Hollywood.
Yes, right. Any crossing a picket line is something you do not do. Yeah. But anyway, I was interested in that. I'm always interested in, obviously those women, Eleanor Perry and Carole Eastman, are just two of, the 70s in Hollywood, which everybody talks about, Altman and Coppola, and they don't talk about, they do now, but they talk less about Carole Eastman, Polly Platt, Toby Rafelson, Joan Tewksbury, even Eleanor Coppola.
Elaine May.
And Elaine May, also an incredible example of someone who was scapegoated for a flop, right, for Ishtar, in ways that, and I think this is exactly what happened to Carole Eastman on The Fortune, too. It's like, the woman winds up wearing the failure so that the men can walk away scot-free.
So I want to change gears a bit.
Yes.
One of the reasons I wanted to ask you on the show is that I don't think I've ever read a book quite like this. I mean, the closest thing I can think of is something like Claire Dieter's Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma. I know that your book jacket says something like part memoir, part cultural criticism. And now if you're a nonfiction writer, there's a buzz term, memoir plus, which is like the personal side and then the research angle.
Yeah.
But I feel like you're doing something really different, which is that you're using these autobiographical moments as kind of a jumping off point to interrogate these people. But then there's also this kind of conversation, this kind of lateral move that happens between those public figures and yourself, partly because your stories actually intersect for various reasons that have to do with your own story, with your own family. First of all, does that sound right to you?
Yeah, that sounds about right. I will say, I'm always, it is interesting to me that this now seems to be a real thing, right? I mean, people, all kinds of people are writing hybrid memoirs or whatever you want to call it. And I'd like to pretend that I, invented the wheel or something there. I definitely did not. I feel like, again, Hilton Als's book was an obvious forerunner. I think something like Olivia Lang's The Lonely City is not a million miles from that. Have you read that?
I haven't, no.
Well, you should. It does something. I mean, I had certainly read Olivia's book, and I remember thinking, I could do something like this. I knew that if I did it, it would come out nothing like her book, and it is nothing like her book. But that's a really lovely book, and it is certainly similar in its structure. There is a personal narrative, and each chapter dives into the work of a different artist. And I honestly think too, it's the one trick with being a writer, I think, is you always have to feel like you're kind of inventing the form a little bit, because where's the fun, where's the joy and discovery in it if you don't have that feeling. Even if you're writing a novel, you have to sort of feel like, well, this, I'm doing it my way. But I do think nobody has invented anything yet these days. I mean, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. And sometimes non-giants, The
narrator is also really intriguing to me. My first love is the personal essay or the classic essay. And there's this kind of very Didion-esque quality to your narrator. And I think it has to do with the sense of your consciousness on the page, the way that the narrator reflects or takes stock.
Yeah.
Was that a voice that you arrived at easily?
Voice is always a curious thing, because I always feel like it's what comes first. And once I can locate the voice for any piece of writing, anything at all, a magazine piece, a novel, a short story, and that it always happens. It has to happen very fast. You have to somehow be able to stake out the parameters of the voice inside of a paragraph or two, or you're screwed. And so I think, I don't know about easily, but certainly naturally. This was a book where I think I pretty much, once I wrote that little scene, which it doesn't identify where it's set, but it's set on Kings Road in Beverly, just down the block from where I live. And it's like, I thought, I felt like I had it in the pocket. And it's always somehow about kind of inventing a plausible, almost like an alternative version of myself. The voice in that book is kind of a noir voice. It has a kind of noir quality.
I know that before this, you wrote a pair of novels, and certainly at the time, you were thought primarily of as a fiction writer, and that may still be how you think of yourself.
Yeah, it is. I have another book coming, the one that I'm just finishing. It's also a memoir, but it's probably even less conventional than this. And it's definitely very, very, very novel-like. There's no kind of essayistic voice in it. It's really pretty much a straight up, everything is in scene. A lot of it involves moments that are either before I was born or third person kind of points of view that I'm choosing to enter. And
is that the connection for you? You feel like between your novels, your fiction, and
I think I am fundamentally a novelist. I'm always happy to write literary criticism, but even or film criticism. But whenever I'm doing that, I'm still, it's always about kind of like the private response as an artist. and I think that's kind of part of being a fiction writer or a novelist is, anything that you write is a kind of criticism in code.
Yeah.
You're always responding to other texts, always.
Right.
And I think that's, just to answer your question, yes, I do think of myself as a novelist. My tools are a novelist. I'm not a historian. I'm not a journalist. I don't always have the sort of patience to write a certain kind of nonfiction. So there has to be speculation in it, even if, I think with these last two books, with Always Crashing and with this current one, I've definitely, there's a rigid set of rules. I don't let myself just I can't bend the historical record either around other people for obvious reasons or around myself. I won't sort of do a sort of James Fry thing where I'm positing experiences I didn't have. But without the inventive part, I lose interest.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, one thing I picked up from your book, and you said this a moment ago, is that you don't think of yourself primarily as a journalist or that kind of narrative nonfiction writer. But there's a lot of research involved in your book, certainly a lot of interviews. I know for the Carole Eastman chapter where the record was kind of thin, you talked to a lot of people and
and read a lot of primary sources. That's always my favorite. I do like kind of rooting around in people's archives and papers. That's a real pleasure. And interestingly, I think has sort of become a facet of, as I'm sort of thinking that my next book will probably be a novel. I don't know that for sure. But even if it is, it's going to drill so deep into, I would never think of myself as a sort of research-intensive writer, but I like doing it. I feel like more and more a piece of fiction even has to kind of maintain contact with certain aspects of reality and of history to really hold my attention.
How do you keep the research, or is this even a concern for you? I mean, how do you keep the research from swamping everything else?
Oh, well, that's a good question. And what I would say is that as much as I like doing it, I have a horror of doing too much of it. I really do. I don't think I'm really the kind of writer then that's kind of what I mean when I say I'm not a journalist or I'm not a kind of narrative nonfiction writer. I just can't bear it. I get itchy. Even as I'm researching, I have such itchy feet. And sometimes there's kind of recklessness that goes along with that where I think like, well, I don't know that I would necessarily trust myself to be the primary historian on this matter because I'm just a little too chaotic. I feel like I do my research in these kind of, there's a kind of long tail, slow research where it's like I'm always reading, I'm always watching, I'm always wool gathering. But when I'm doing a kind of like archival dive on a given person, I think for Carole Eastman, I had like 2 days to go through, 28 boxes of papers, and there was a certain way in which I just kind of approached it like a lion, pouncing on a carcass, where I was just kind of like, digging into it and just being like, this, and all, just zeroing in on certain details that I wanted. It's intuitive. I'm not methodical in my research. I'm kind of ravenous and a little deranged about it, like a fiction writer.
So for the last part of our interview, I want to ask you about something that happened about a dozen years ago when I joined the literary magazine, The Rumpus.
Yes.
And they had a service at the time. It was called Letters in the Mail.
Letters in the Mail, yes.
And I remember receiving yours. In fact, I was looking for it before this interview. It's buried somewhere in all my junk.
Is there a Marlon Brando? Is that the one with the Marlon Brando story?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah. And it has to do with your dad, who's a famous Hollywood agent as well. Can you remind listeners what that great Marlon Brando story is?
Well, it's interesting to me because there are two versions of it, and the truer version of it exists in the book that I'm just finishing. It's not a big part of it. My father was Marlon Brando's agent at the tail end of Marlon's life and career. And the actual story is that one night he called my father's house and left this absolutely phenomenal monologue on his answering machine. My then wife and I had just moved to LA, and we were staying at my dad's house, and we were looking for apartments, and we came back from looking for an apartment, and we hit the play button on this machine, and there was this kind of, Marlon was on the set of a movie called The Score, which was the last movie he ever did. And I can't do a credible imitation, unfortunately, but we press the play button, and immediately at Brando, Fred, you gotta get me off this picture. I'm pecking at tranquilizers like a goose at corn. Just these kind of baroque, ornate, phenomenal, and it was just this great sort of Brandovian monologue of complaint.
Wild.
And my wife and I played it again and again. We just were, we wound up just sitting there. We were acting it out. We were, started drinking vodka. And my dad came home, and we're like rolling on the floor laughing. We're like, Dad, you got to listen to this. And we play him the message, and his face is a total blank. And I'm like, come on, man, this is hilarious. And he goes over and he picks up, he just doesn't say anything. He just goes over, picks up the telephone, and calls his answering service at work. And Brando had left the same message, like the exact same, this kind of wild, extemporized monologue, word for word, on his service at work. And it was just this weird kind of thing about actors and their kind of spiraling kind of tendency to internalize. It was as if he'd written the monologue in his head, memorized it, and then delivered it. It was crazy.
So the subtitle of your book is On Art, Crisis, and Los Angeles, California. And
Right.
You certainly grew up what I would call, just from that last story, celebrity adjacent.
Yes.
And while you're not really a Hollywood kid exactly, you did grow up in that milieu. And
Yes.
I'm kind of curious as to what you think, if there's one thing, or rather, let me ask this. What's one thing that you think that people never get right about Hollywood?
Well, listen,
There's many things.
Yeah, well, no, I would just say this. It's interesting. I grew up in that environment and kind of grew up kicking against it with all of my might and main. By the time I was a teenager, I was just like, I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to be a novelist. I don't care about the movies. I'm not really interested in Hollywood in any way. And I somehow had that kind of feeling, which I think was common in the 80s, sort of like LA is a cultural desert. I'm going to go to New York and I'm going to do something else. So it's interesting that I have now written 3 consecutive books about varying aspects of it. I've kind of made my peace with that. I feel like, like Toni Morrison had Ohio, and Saul Bellow had Chicago, and Philip Roth had Newark, and, Faulkner had Oxford, Mississippi. Like, fuck it. Like, that's, it's an interesting face of American experience and American identity to write about, the movies and what it means. But I would say the biggest, kind of thing that people, I think, there's a kind of assumption that like a Hollywood childhood means, swimming pools and servants and, endless cocaine.
Like Bret Easton Ellis.
Yes, Bret Easton Ellis. And, it's interesting because Bret, who I didn't come to know until later, but, Bret didn't even grow up in Hollywood. He grew up in the Valley and in Los Angeles. His family didn't have anything to do with Hollywood. But yes, there are these assumptions. And until I was pretty much until I was an adult, my parents were middle class people. And I don't mean the kind of like fake middle class that you talk about when you're rich. I mean, my dad didn't represent any movie stars until the 90s. He had Marlon Brando late. It was like late in his career he picked up. And by the time, basically, I was in school by the time he signed De Niro and Gene Hackman, and he sort of became a big deal. When I was a kid, it was just television actors for the most part, or kind of character actors. Bruce Dern, Stacy Keach. My dad made a big run at Warren Oates. Like, people that were very, very, very cool, like phenomenal talents, but were not like making huge amounts of money. I think there was a time in the very early 60s where my dad had represented Jack Nicholson, and it was too early. He couldn't get Jack a job. So, Jack had moved on by the time his ship came in. It's like we really like, and again, this is a thing I kind of drill into in the book that I am just finishing, but it's like there was a middle class in the movies, and there was a kind of world of people who were just kind of making an ordinary living in the arts. Not maybe like a little better than ordinary. It's like we had a 2-story, 3-bedroom house that my parents paid $100,000 for in 1977. And, and that was then, not a cheap house, but also then like wasn't like some unattainable, that wasn't Sunset Boulevard estate money by any means. And I do think that the kind of disappearance of a middle class in all of the arts, right? Because there is no middle class for musicians, there is no middle class for writers, right? And there's barely even, with the exception of a very few people, there's just, you're a writer, you're poor. at least when it comes to the writing itself. And then I was able to sort of carve out a modest livelihood as a screenwriter for a while has been helpful. But even then, it wasn't. That's gone, and I think that's an enormous thing to
reckon with.
Yeah,
I feel like there have been all these stories this spring in these really high-profile places. There was a piece in a big long essay in Harper's. There's been a bunch of pieces in the LA Times. They're all kind of pointing to the fact that the latest writer strike last year, that it really it didn't really get the writers all the things that they thought they were going to get. Is that part and parcel about what you're thinking about?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think that the book that I am finishing is the sort of the story of how it came to be that way. It does not run all the way through the more recent one, but I mean, what happened in the more recent strike is just a kind of extension of what happened in the 2008 strike, which is, I think always writers win these gains or workers win these gains. And in the case of a place like Hollywood, the corporations will always claw them back, and they'll claw them back by just shrinking the pie, right? They'll just be like, that's how they do it. They'll just be like, well, we're going to make fewer movies, and that means we're going to employ fewer people, and the fact is, I think Coppola said something very interesting about when he was at Cannes, when he was talking about Megalopolis. He said, the people who run these places aren't in the movie business, they're in the debt servicing business. Someone like David Zaslav, it's not about making movies at all. It's about, they've all gone into enormous debt on the back of all of their acquisitions, and all they fucking care about is servicing that.
Ooh,
debt.
Boy. Well, Matthew, I just want to thank you so much for making the time to talk with me this morning.
Oh, thank you. Such a pleasure. Really, really. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to my interview with Matthew Specktor. I'm Paul Zakrzewski. If you enjoyed the show, then I hope you will subscribe in Apple Podcasts. I'm always grateful for reviews and for sharing the show with friends. To get show notes and a transcript, please check out my newsletter, The Book I Want to Write. That's at bookiwanttowrite.substack.com. Every couple of weeks, I also publish short essays about writing mindset, developments in publishing, personal essays, and more. If you're working on your own book you have to write, or you want to get started, maybe I can help. Find out more about me and my book coaching at bookiwanttowrite.substack.com. And thanks again for listening.